Very grateful to our partner, the ADL, for providing this program tonight, for all of their support over the years to combat anti-Semitism and senseless hatred. We've done a lot of programs with them, and when we scheduled this event, I think few of us imagined what would have occurred in Washington, D.C., and certainly makes tonight's program even more timely. Tomorrow, my weekly teaching is reflecting a little bit on from Charlottesville to D.C., but I think from a religious perspective, we have to not get mired in righteous indignation, but really to try to seize upon the positive things we can do to start helping to bring God's light into the world. And I think ADL's particularly effective to teach us some of those tools. So very grateful. And Steve, I see you very clean looking haircut, looking good tonight. So thank you for all you do for us. And I hope a happier new year for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. So good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Kramer. I'm a member of Temple Sholom. And in addition to welcoming Temple Sholom congregants and supporter of ADL, I also want to acknowledge a number of local churches who are joining us tonight for this very important dialogue, one that is very much an interfaith issue and not just a Jewish one. And I do want to thank Rabbi Mitch for inviting his colleagues from the Greenwich Fellowship of Clergy and to their congregations. I'm equally grateful to the ADL and Oren Segal for taking time out of his very busy schedule to speak with us tonight. As Vice President of the Center of Extremism, Oren and his team combat extremism and all forms of hate in the real world and online. Recognized as the foremost authority on extremism, the center provides expertise, training which enables law enforcement, public officials, and internet and technology companies to identify and counter emerging threats. Oren joined ADL in 1998 after working for the New York Times and the Jewish Community Federation in San Francisco. Much of Oren's 22 years with ADL have been devoted to evaluating the activity and tactics of extreme groups and movements from across the ideological spectrum, training law enforcement officers and publishing reports and articles on a wide range of extremist topics. In 2006, Oren was recognized by the FBI for his exceptional service in the public interest. He was named to the Forward's list of 50 influential, intriguing, and inspiring American Jews in 2019. Oren is a graduate of Wheaton College in Massachusetts, and according to his staff in the Connecticut region, he's also a really wonderful person and a great colleague. A little bit of bookkeeping before we get started. Everyone is set to mute. If you would like to ask a question, please write your question into the chat to Steve Ginsburg. We will get to as many of the questions as we can. And with that said, Oren, I would now like to turn tonight's conversation over to you, and I believe Steve.
Thanks a lot, Scott. I think we're going to jump right into Oren because we're so lucky to have him. This, my colleague Oren and friend, has been incredibly busy the last couple years, the last couple days, the last few weeks. It's really a privilege to have him here. We'll share with you a little bit about how ADL Connecticut connects and works with Oren and his team to make sure that we're keeping everybody in Connecticut informed and safe and aware of what's going on. But let's turn it over to Oren so he can share with us what trends he's been seeing and what we're providing to the community.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Rabbi, for excuse me, having me. Thank you all for making the time. I see you're not getting your fill of hate and extremism from the news, so you decided to try to join another Zoom for that. So I appreciate it. You know, I know that people generally only want to hear from me when bad things are happening, which actually means my team and I are quite in demand recently. I can't even count really how many times over the past couple of years I've sort of started a briefing or conversation just saying like how timely this topic is, right? Oh, the topic is so timely. But every time I've said it, it's been true. I mean, we have been in the midst of some really difficult times in this country, well before, January 6th. And so what I hope to do is really engage with all of you and, answer questions and what's on your mind, see if I can help you understand a little bit more about the Center on Extremism, the ADL, how we work with our regional offices and how critical that is. But I'll start with just some, initial remarks, just to maybe frame what we're seeing, and how we're sort of approaching and understanding the situation that we're literally in the middle of right now. So I guess I should start by saying, and this is really important, that what happened on January 6th in DC may have been the most predictable act of political violence in modern American history. Now, I know that might sound like hyperbole, but certainly the prediction part, predictable, there's no denying that. Anyone who has been paying attention to the activity around the country, for a long time, but certainly even since the pandemic, the chorus of disinformation that we've seen, the violent acts that we've seen. If you spent any time on social media, even if you paid attention to what happened in DC in the 6 months leading up to it with protests that became violent, you'd have a reasonably good idea of what was going to happen that day. And so I just, as a reminder, the idea of storming the Capitol in DC seems shocking, but we have sort of seen something like that in different parts of the country over the past year. You may recall when the pandemic hit and there were protests against some of the lockdown measures. And I want to be clear about something. I think at that time, there was a portrayal of people who were showing up as all extremists. And I don't think that that's true. In fact, I don't even think that that's true in DC. You had people who were concerned about their livelihood, who shutting down businesses was really going to have an impact on them. You had people who just didn't believe that the pandemic was real. Everybody sort of deals with things in a different way. But you had protests at state capitals around the country. Some of them, however, were 100% exploited by some of the extremist elements that you have probably been seeing on a loop, in the news recently. In Michigan, the Capitol was stormed by armed militias. It wasn't violent the way we saw in DC. Nobody died in those, but it was a very, very inflammatory situation. We saw it in Salem, Oregon, in Boise, Idaho, in other parts of the country where people were gathering, arming themselves, angry about what was happening. And it wasn't just sort of the realities of the day. Many people were showing up because of QAnon conspiracy theories, right? So all of this shouldn't be a complete surprise, especially when we also look at, the extremist violence that we've been experiencing over the past couple of years, the normalization of some of these ideas that animate extremists every single day, the use of social media as sort of a catalyzing force in some of this, which I want to talk a little bit more about later. And so, bottom line, you don't have to be somebody who spends way too much time of their day looking at extremism to have not been surprised. This was organized and planned, in plain sight. And, one of the things that I'm sure some of you may have been thinking about when you initially saw some of the scenes was, maybe hearkening back to Charlottesville. But I want to say there are some similarities. There are some through lines there, but it's actually quite different in many ways as well that I hope to sort of talk through with all of you. So one of the through lines, though, I would say is that, anti-Semitism and bigotry more broadly was an element, an animating factor, maybe not the primary one. But I will say that when people are willing to act, to physically, come together based on conspiracies that are peddled by QAnon, based on the concept of a stolen election, when social media is telling them that this is all of a lie, it's only a couple stones throws away from anti-Semitism. I mean, and you've seen the images of people storming the Capitol. One guy with like Camp Auschwitz hoodie, right? Mocking the Holocaust in the middle of an insurrection. Some of the extremists that were there that we had warned about, that we had been letting people know that they were on the way, were white supremacists. And so, you know, anti-Semitism didn't animate everybody there, but for many, or a handful, it was certainly a part of the experience and what brought them there. And if I can make one other point about this through line, this is something some of you may have read in the news, but I think it also speaks to this sort of issue that I'm talking about. 36 hours after the storming of the Capitol of the United States, and even that sentence saying that, I'm going to say it a lot because it's still sort of strange that I could say that. We had an incident at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City, where somebody put a Confederate flag and tied it to the door of that museum. Again, a Confederate flag, right? One of the sort of seminal images that came out of the rally and riot in DC, somebody walking through the Capitol with a Confederate flag. So somebody was trying to send a message, right? And this is the message that I see repeated over and over on social media. Again, about the Jewish role in some of the gripes that people coalesced around. So it's still a story about anti-Semitism to some degree, but we can explore that further maybe in the Q&A. I'd also like to explore what we're doing about it, right? I mean, these are hard times. I will say I feel personally lucky not only to work with, you know, people in regional offices like all the folks on the call here, but around the country, because frankly, I can do something about it, right? When the blank hits the fan, I have something to do that day that is directly in response to what is occurring. I feel like that is a privilege that I have. And we were doing a lot, and I'll talk about it. Before we get there, I do want to sort of talk about what do we think is going to happen? How bad are things really? You know, is the extremist landscape going to get worse? So I always say, like, we need not panic. It's really important to keep perspective. But we also can't refuse to ignore the extremist threat that I believe does have some staying power. And it's a different type of an extremist threat. We have to focus on the long game. You know, what we saw in DC is not going to go away anytime soon. And one of the reasons for that is that for this, you know, longevity is that social media, even some leaders that we expect to lead, have provided a gift of a narrative that animates some of these extremists and will animate them certainly for the next 4 years, right? A story of a stolen election, all thanks to the mainstream media, the left, you know, pedophiles, if you're into QAnon, right? These absurd theories. But as the narrative goes, it's those people who are suppressing the rights and the voices of you know, real Americans. And I have to say, extremists are the most dangerous when they are animated by these concepts and narratives of something being taken away from them, right? Of being exploited. So, you know, one of the movements we look at, they're called accelerationist white supremacists. And I should say we look at all extremist movements. What they believe, and white supremacists in general believe, is that the white race is going to be extinct, that the power that they had in this country has been completely removed. And there are people responsible for that. Black people, immigrants, Muslims, the Jews controlling all of it, right? This is what leads people to shoot 11 people in Pittsburgh, or a shooting in Poway, or other parts of the world. The fundamental principle of white supremacy is something being taken away. And for anti-government extremists, you know, one of their fundamental principles, they don't want their guns taken away. They don't want their freedoms taken away. For QAnon, it's liberty, or whatever that means for them. Conspiracy theorists more broadly. So that's why I think this idea of stopping the steal, of undermining democratic institutions, of creating doubt in the democratic process, and not believing the reality and truth of the media, when that is repeated over and over on people's, you know, phones, when it's repeated over and over in the public discussion, that's one of the reasons I believe there is staying power to an extremist movement that is reacting in response to that. Now, let me just talk a little bit about the short term. There's a fair amount of chatter going on about, you know, possible extremist actions starting, this weekend through Inauguration Day. The online rhetoric about the inauguration in the circles that, my team and I are looking at, these extremist circles, are amplifying many of the, tropes that you would think. They're celebrating what happened. They believe that violence is the step to the, revolution. For some, it's the beginning of their civil war. And they view it as a success, as a success in general, what happened at the Capitol. But the good news is, right, we always have to try to find some good news, is a lot of these people are getting arrested. Some of them are being brought to justice. And I have to say, with our help in some cases, that actually helps make people a little paranoid. The fact that we might also have the most tightly controlled and restricted area in inauguration history may also keep people away from DC. But you've probably seen the news talking about January 17th and other rallies, not just in DC, but at state capitals around the country. And listen, I'm not going to tell you that nobody's going to show up in some state capital for a protest, maybe armed, maybe radical, right? Because we've seen it throughout the year. That wouldn't be anything new. But what I do know is that a lot of the hyperbole that we're seeing, we can't take lightly, but a lot of it is just that. They know people will report on it. So I'm in this kind of difficult situation where we have to be prepared, but we have to understand that others are preparing for this too, and not completely, freak out, if you will. But to that point, I do think that it's more likely for issues to happen locally than in DC again. These are just places closer to home. As I mentioned, the sites of protest throughout the year. And again, there's sort of a coalescing that happens locally that I think is actually a big part of understanding this movement. Because I think we're witnessing sort of this very American sort of extremist movement that is emerging, that combines all sorts of extremists that we've seen before. But many of them are just, if you will, providing their allegiance, expressing their allegiance to Trump. They believe that the election was stolen, that he is being taken away from them. Now, again, most people who support Trump are not going to be extremists, but there is an emerging extremist movement within some supporters. And I think we saw many of them, frankly, on display in DC. And they're, again, fed by a steady diet of disinformation, lies, conspiracy theories. They're adjacent to other extremists. What was interesting about DC is at the same time you had pro-Trump supporters who wouldn't go anywhere near an extremist activity, they were surrounded by extremists who would. So when they looked to the left, they saw QAnon. When they looked to the right, they saw militias or white supremacists. Some of them, in fact, got wrapped up in that and became extremists on that day. But it's more than that, right? It's more than just showing up in person. And here's an anecdote that to me kind of says it all. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, the live streaming that occurred where people, everybody takes a selfie. We're living in a selfie culture. You get a piece of pizza, you take a selfie. You buy a new car, another selfie. You see somebody in the street who's famous, you bother them and you take a selfie. Well, during an insurrection, in the United States at the Capitol, a lot of people were also taking selfies. And a lot of them were actually live streaming their activities. There was one anti-Semite and white supremacist named Baked Alaska, who was actually live streaming it where he would put his legs up on the desks of Congress people and telling people what he's seeing around them. So he's putting on a show. But here's what we need to remember, is that not only did this individual become part of a violent riot, but there were thousands, in some cases, of people watching him. And they weren't just watching him. They were communicating with him through this device, encouraging him to go to certain representative offices, telling him to go hang Mike Pence, right? Encouraging his activity. So it was an extremist loop. As this person is putting on a show, bringing them on the journey of a riot with him, they too were able to participate in this journey from the comfort of their own home and egging him on. It reminded me actually a little bit like the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand, where the individual actually filmed it and live streamed it for the world to see as it was happening. There's a reason that people do that. There's a reason they are preparing their social media at the same time that they're preparing their acts, right? Because this has become a weapon. And it's not necessarily, throw it at someone's head and hope you knock them out, but it's a weapon in the fight for hearts and minds. And again, that's what we saw on display. So I'm happy to talk more about social media as well, because I think that's an area where we're putting a lot of pressure and a lot of sort of revealing some of the issues there in hopes of sort of making a change there. And by the way, you've probably heard many of the companies are now removing some of these extremists from their platforms. They're shutting down an entire platform called Parler, which was used by a good range of extremists. But isn't that what always happens, right? After Charlottesville, after Christchurch, after insurrection at the Capitol last week, that's when these companies start taking like more a blatant action. But what we need is for that to become a standard practice, not to be something that is happening only after there's blood in the street. So extremist violence is not the sole domain of anyone, extremist movement or ideology. We don't have a luxury to ignore from threats from any part of the ideological spectrum. Anti-Semitism in particular is not unique to any one group, any one movement, any one side of the political aisle. But we have a responsibility not to make it political. What we saw in DC were people making these concepts of conspiracies and hatred and disinformation, and they made it political. And so that's one of the takeaways for me. We see what happens. And this is hard because one of the unique elements of anti-Semitism in particular is that it can be wielded as a weapon by anybody, right, to conform to their worldview, no matter which side. That's kind of the unique thing about anti-Semitism. So I'll just stop there and say, I hope that this summary, raises some questions. And I hope we can focus not only on some of the issues that I mentioned, but maybe some of the solutions that we're taking and some of the solutions we should be thinking about. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions that are there.
Thanks very much, Oren. As the questions come in, we got some ahead of time. And for those who joined late, I'm Steve Ginsburg. I'm the head of the Connecticut Regional Office for ADL. And as just so you understand the background here, ADL is one national global organization. We've got 25 regional offices around the country. We've got one in Europe and one in Israel. Connecticut is its own regional office. We are proud to cover our whole state. We do work in schools. We do work with religious communities. We fight all forms of hate. We take in incidents, reports, and work a ton with law enforcement. And a lot of our work with law enforcement involves our work with Oren and his team at the Center on Extremism. There's also a parallel organization at ADL called the Center for Technology and Society. And one of the things that you probably saw in Oren's remarks is how his work at the Center on Extremism is very interwoven with social media. And how it feeds and grows through social media, but it also enables us to track extremist groups and movements and trends through social media. So I thought, Oren, maybe you could, there's a couple questions that we got that talk about social media as it relates to free speech. And we talk about the steps that we've taken or are taking to make sure that hate doesn't spread, but how do we make sure that we continue to have a thriving civil exchange in our country of ideas?
Yeah, so the question of sort of free speech comes up a lot when we're talking about how do we, prevent the exploitation of these platforms. And by platforms, I mean the things that we all have heard of, Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, but also like platforms like DLive. Anybody hear of DLive? This is where you can stream yourself. That's what the white supremacist was using at the Capitol, or Gab, or Parler, or basically any place that my kids spend time on to talk to their friends and do stuff, that's where my investigators are spending their time. So how do we protect free speech there? Well, first of all, let's talk about sort of what that question suggests. This is not, these companies are not like the public sphere. This is not having a rally, in front of the Capitol where you can get a permit. These are private companies. They can allow or disallow whatever they want on their platforms. It's up to them in a sense. And for me or you not to tell them that we don't think that you should allow incitement to violence, Holocaust denial, right, harassment on your platform, for me not to be able to say that publicly, encourage them to change, would be me not being able to use my freedom of speech. In fact, when extremists are using and leveraging these platforms to make people unsafe, to make people like they can't speak out, that is curtailing other people's freedom of speech. So we just fundamentally believe that it's not unreasonable for people to expect that the platforms that they use, which are making money off of our time and usage, to do something so that hatred and extremists don't feel comfortable there. So for me, it's not a question of free speech. It's a question of corporate responsibility. It's a question of values. And it's not unreasonable for people to say, this does not match my values. Now, here's the truth. You're never going to completely find ways to move extremism and hate completely offline. And my own thinking in this has evolved. I was concerned a couple of years ago that if extremists were removed off of certain platforms and they went to smaller platforms, it would be harder for us to see them, what they're talking about. They would be surrounded by the other extremists only and solely, and that may be sort of a concentrated echo chamber that would radicalize them more. But seeing what I'm seeing now, I think the fact that they have a harder time reaching a lot of people with their hateful ideas is probably a good thing. They'll find somewhere else to go. Making it a little harder for my kids to find them, I think we should all feel comfortable with that.
Thank you. All right, so a couple other common questions coming up. I'm going to try to sum them up and present them to you so you can give us some thoughts on how to think about some things. So one of them is, we talk about these things at ADL and frankly as a national dialogue, international dialogue, as there's, we're talking about right-wing extremism when we talk about white supremacists. And then sometimes we talk about left-wing extremism. That can be the Antifa group perhaps and other groups. There's a lot of concern in our community about all different ones in this big spectrum of hate. And I was wondering if you could share with people how ADL looks at those, at the different groups, at the different perspectives. And frankly, I personally find left-wing and right-wing to be not helpful terms as we analyze these things, because they tend, the left-wing people who are conservative, perhaps Republican, are more focused on the left-wing extremists, and people who are left-wing or Democrat might be, or liberal or Democrat might be more concerned about the right-wing, and that's really not how we look at it. Can you talk about how we handle sort of the politics of hate as it's being presented in a partisan way by the media and everyone else? You're on mute. Did I mute you? Lori, can you unmute Oren? Trying.
I'm trying.
Okay.
Hold on. There we go.
Thank you. See, I've been silenced on social media
Sorry
by
about that.
various Jews. You see, this is what we've been telling you. Anyway, so the question, yeah, I will not mute myself again so that I don't have to, I will not mute myself again so I can unmute myself. Okay. Yeah, I think, Steve, it's a really important point, and I'm going to tell you right now, the 20 or so investigators and analysts that are looking at anti-Semitism and bigotry and extremism every day, we're not waking up and saying, we're going to look at this type. We're looking at extremism, period. Left, right, Islamist, everything. Same thing with anti-Semitism, right? I mean, we need to stop thinking about it as a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue. We need to think about it as anti-Semitism, period, and do what we need to do to speak out against it. So I agree. Sometimes it's used as a political football, which is not only really unhelpful, but actually it's the anti-Semites that benefit from it most, right? When they're putting people at odds over that topic. But so we can just agree to not use those terms, but there are differences in extremist groups, right? I mean, part of this is understanding, who they are and what they do. So a white supremacist has a specific type of ideology, right? An anti-government extremist, or, if we can get more specific, there's a boogaloo, it's a word, I can explain it if you want, but a specific type of anti-government, they have a specific set of views and ideas that animate them, right? The Black Hebrew Israelites, the individual who shot in Jersey City, at the kosher market there, that person had a unique ideology. What we do is try to understand those unique ideologies, but we also are going to try to, mitigate those threats in the same way, no matter where it's coming from, right? If we see something that we believe is a threat to the community, we're going to reach out to our law enforcement partners and say, please help. I don't care which side they're coming from, right? I do think, though, we can't be sort of Pollyannish about it, right? I think for the last year, there have been, public pronouncements from elected leaders that have basically tried to equate anybody who votes Democratic as a radical left and Antifa. I'm saying that is not helpful in the public discussion. And anybody who says about Trump that that person is actually a white supremacist through and through, probably not helpful for the public discussion. But there are some stark facts. We rely on data, right, to animate our priorities, to understand where the threats are coming from without ignoring any of the threats. And here's one data point. Over the last 10 years, 400, and at this point now, it would be over 450 people have been killed by extremists in this country. 75% of them have been killed by what is traditionally called right-wing extremists, anti-government types, white supremacists. That's relevant. 24% have been killed by Islamist extremists. That's also relevant. So we don't have to be fearful of turning everything political because we're identifying where the threats are coming from. It's up to us not to allow people, right, to manipulate us to have those generally unhelpful conversations. Let's just agree that especially the Jewish community doesn't have a luxury to ignore threats from any ideological motivated movement or group.
Great. Couple questions about January 6th. And they might relate to some of the other things you've already discussed, but some people are asking, what was the makeup of what groups were in the crowd motivating action? Also, do you have any information or suppositions as to why law enforcement, Capitol Police was so woefully underprepared?
Yeah. So the makeup of the folks, these are the, we issued a resource prior to the event, letting people know, the public know who we knew was going to show up. We had obviously shared information with law enforcement as well. And among those extremists that showed up were a couple white supremacist groups. There's a group called the New Jersey European Heritage Association. There's a neo-Nazi group from Massachusetts. You had a group called America First, the Groyper Army, which is led by an individual's white supremacist. So you had some white supremacists. You had some conspiracy theorists, people like Alex Jones, who believed that whatever. We all know about Alex Jones. We've also had some anti-government types who showed up, some kind of more militia-y types. But unlike Charlottesville, where we predicted it was going to be the largest gathering of white supremacists we've ever seen, really, in 10 years, we also knew that there were going to be a range of people who were showing up because they believed that the election was stolen, that they were animated, and some had extreme ideas about what they thought would need to happen if the election was going to be stolen from them. But they weren't, part of any movement per se. They were just there because they were upset. And this is what's different between what we saw in DC and Charlottesville. And an interesting fact that may help explain this, after Charlottesville occurred, within, I think it was 4 days, we had identified over 250 of the people who were there by name. We knew who was there. We knew who was showing up. Right now, we've identified about 60 plus. Those are the people who are on our radar. That means most of these people were not part of established, extremist movements, which is, otherwise we probably would have known more, right? And so that's the part that is different here. There's an emerging movement that is animated more by disinformation than white supremacy, more by conspiracy theory than it is classic anti-government ideas. And this is something we are going to have to deal with. We cannot pretend it does not exist. Was there a part 2 of that question, by the way, that I forgot? Now Steve is muted.
We did get a part 2 while you were asking. There was a question about the anti-government types in general. Did they have a political affiliation? Or were they there to support the president? Were they left-wing, right-wing? The anti-government within that group, were they any specific
they were,
political ideology?
There were groups like the Oath Keepers, which are, traditionally right-wing extremists. There was Boogaloo movement, which is interesting because the Boogaloo is much more diverse in terms of sort of where they fit. Another reason why sometimes thinking left and right isn't helpful, because there are Boogaloo types who are very much, not only anti-government and anti-authority, but, we're marching with Black Lives Matter, which people tend to associate with the left, right? And so, and then there was a whole bunch of folks who are sort of unaffiliated, but, clearly based on their clothing, some of their symbols seem a little bit more like, adhere to sort of militia concepts. But here's the deal. Outside of a couple of groups that just don't like Donald Trump, like some of those in the Boogaloo, if we're going to have to label them, these were people who are pro-Trump supporters. That's why they were there. They believed that the election was being stolen from Donald Trump. They were animated by things that he had said. They were animated by stuff that they had seen online, not just, any one person. So, who wasn't there? Antifa, that people talk about. Antifa, that is always attacking police. They weren't there. It was the other folks that are attacking police. They're called the Proud Boys. They're called the Oath Keepers. They're called apparently QAnon conspiracists now. So again, extremism is not the sole domain of any one extremist movement or political ideology.
So you're right. There was a part 2 to the other question, and it was about why, if we knew what was, who was coming, why law enforcement was.
Law enforcement, right. This is hard. This is hard for me to answer. I feel like this was deja vu all over again with Charlottesville. I asked some of the same questions, to be honest. Why weren't they more prepared? And I don't have that answer. An investigation needs to be done about Capitol Police, about, the National Guard, I know people have been taught, like, what happened? Why weren't they deployed sooner? There's a lot of questions that I frankly just cannot answer. I do not know. I think today there was more information about, FBI, who knew a lot about extremists, who had them on like no-fly lists or something, that they were showing up. I think part of the challenge is much of what is animating people to violence is actually protected speech. It's not illegal to be part of some extremist movement in this country. We don't designate groups and movements in this country the way we designate ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Not that any one of you would do this, but if any of you wanted to provide money to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, you can get arrested for providing material support to a terrorist entity. There is no equivalent here. In America, you can be as hateful as you want. That is our freedom. And so part of maybe why there wasn't, pre-action was because so much of this was protected speech. Why it was allowed to get so out of hand and why people weren't more prepared, I just don't have an answer for that. But we all should demand to get answers for that as soon as possible.
If I can add a little bit just from Connecticut's side, and to let you know what has happened since. I had a conversation with Senator Murphy's staff. He runs a legislative committee in the Congress that oversees the Capitol Police. So there's a lot of resources being devoted to figuring out what happened here. And on the local level, there has also been a great deal of effort, and some people ask questions about this, about how we're preparing for January 17th through the inauguration, what's happening here. I and my team have been in touch with the governor's office, the FBI, the state police. They are creating a very integrated effort of state and local police and federal backup efforts to ensure that the next several weeks goes fine. I mean, they're sort of way over preparing, which is, I think, what we need to do right now. And they're going to do everything they can to not make the mistakes that happened on January 6th in DC. There's no specific Connecticut-focused threat that people are aware of right now. There's, I think that the team that they've assembled, the technology that they've enabled to make sure that they know who's coming and what could happen is, I'm feeling, I'm not in law enforcement, I'm feeling very comfortable that we're going to be okay here. And so I want to kind of quell that panic you might be feeling. But I also, Oren, would, it's interesting for those who don't know ADL all that well. We are a civil rights group that focuses on, a wide range of advocacy initiatives, and hate crimes is one of them. And we also work really closely with law enforcement, and that puts us in a unique position. And we're at a time right now where we saw this year there was a law enforcement officer in New Haven who was forced to leave, who is a QAnon supporter, right, in law enforcement. We have a great, a lot of you are from Greenwich. We have a wonderful relationship with the Greenwich Police Department, trained them on Connecticut focused extremist movements last year, trained them on bias last year, their own implicit bias, working to ensure that they are as good as they can be. And so I think that what we're trying to do is improve all of these institutions, keep people safe, and make sure that we're putting the pressure in the right place and engaging all of you in those efforts. And before we get to a last question, I just want to mention that we will be continuing an initiative this year called Backspace Hate, which is our attempt to legislatively criminalize what we were calling online conduct, harassment that happens online, stalking, something called doxing. So if you're interested in learning more about those things, we're going to be at the, we're going to be in Hartford trying to get laws passed to make sure that some of the hate that is criminal gets punished accordingly. So Oren, let's take another question. What can you tell us more about QAnon? Where do you think that's going? Is it a much bigger factor than we realized, and how do we sort of address that?
Yeah, and I just want to, before I get into QAnon, I want to just add one thing to what Steve was saying. You know, prior to the election, in the lead up to the election, there was a lot of concern that there was going to be a lot of political violence around the country. And one of the things that we did was reach out to attorney generals and secretaries of state and, you know, law enforcement, federal, state, and local, and really brief them on everything that we were seeing in terms of threats, what they need to be prepared for. And luckily, and I mean, as we predicted, we didn't think there was going to be like a civil war before the election. We thought it could get a little hairy after. And so even in the last, 7 days, which have been among the most intense, part of the reason they've been among the most intense is because the outreach from not just sort of, media that wants to get ADL to comment on everything, because they value and view our information as credible. But again, law enforcement, government officials, briefings for elected officials, because they are turning to ADL to know what the threat is. Maybe part of that is because things didn't go so well, because maybe they didn't listen. But whether it's intelligence on what we're seeing is going to happen in specific areas, whether it's understanding of the landscape in general, I think it's not a vacuum that ADL is filling. It's that ADL is sort of always there, and they know when the what hits the fan is there. So part of what is keeping us so busy is providing people with the information that's not only actionable, but is contextualizing it. So I'm going to jump to QAnon now, because I'm sure many of you have heard about it. And if you were asked to tell a friend, what is QAnon? It'd be kind of weird, right? You'd struggle a little bit to figure out what it is, because it is so out there. So basically, there's this concept that started on somewhere on the internet around 2017 that was meant to be a joke that then became real. And people who follow this concept of Q believe that the world government is being controlled by a shadowy cabal of pedophiles who will eventually be brought to justice by the President of the United States, President Trump. Now, if this sounds ridiculous to you, you just wait, because it gets a lot more ridiculous. The people who are followers, believe that not only are the pedophiles sort of taking over, but the entertainment industry is part of this effort to engage in sort of child sex slavery, like Tom Hanks. They name him. He's a big figure. Now, Tom Hanks, cool actor. I don't know why they're going after him. They believe that Osama bin Laden was never killed. It's pretty much the sort of conspiracy theory on steroids. Every possible conspiracy that you can think of has been wrapped up in this. But here's the trick. It is such a social media phenomenon that, according to a study by Media Matters, I think it was, between 15 and 30 million people in this country believe elements of it. They may not even know they believe certain things that are actually affiliated with QAnon, because certain people who are promoting this idea use concepts that we would all support. So for example, there was this campaign online to save the children from exploitation. Who here would not say, yeah, I want to save the children, right? We don't want things to happen that are bad. But really what it was a nefarious way to introduce people to this concept of, QAnon, the deep state. There's somebody in the government who's letting us know what's really happening. I mean, this is science fiction and people believe it. But you know what? Should we be that surprised? Because anti-Semitism and the conspiracies that make that up are also science fiction. And for eons, people have believed that. So in some ways, we shouldn't be so surprised that people are so willing to embrace ideas. And part of this too is maybe that's the news that they're getting. Our worldview is created by the people who we surround ourselves with, the news that we imbibe. And when your social media feed is half QAnon conspiracy theories and half legitimate news, you're halfway towards believing that conspiracy.
Okay, I'm going to give you 2 more questions and see what you can do with them. One is, I remember, I think it was last year, the Center on Extremism released a report on misogyny and how that relates to extremist groups. How are you looking at that now? Is that still a big part of recruitment, people who are going into movements? And then the second one relates to sort of giving us some guidance on what we can do, both either locally or even just pressuring our elected officials nationally. What's going on with Section 230 and the social media company platform exemption from, how can we use corporate pressures? Just give us some guidance on how we can get engaged.
All right, so the first one, I remember being at a conference and there was an incredible presentation that talked about all the hallmarks of extremist movements. Like, what are some of the hatreds that make them? Anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, anti-LGBT. And the person was saying, and actually called sort of ADL and other organizations out, you never deal with misogyny, like hatred of women as an entry point. I remember having a conversation with her. I was like, you're right. It's just something that people don't talk enough about. And we did our research and we put together a report, which basically made the case that if you hate somebody because of their religion, their nationality, their sexual orientation, that's one of the driving factors that makes people join some extremist movements. But so is misogyny, so is hatred of women. And to the degree that misogyny is acceptable, you're forgetting, right, ignoring the fact that it's a gateway to extremism just like anything else. So for our work, we look at sort of the very misogynistic movements in order to try to identify extremists. There's a whole subculture, and I'm not going to get too involved in this because, again, this is one of these wild things that becomes true, but they're called incels. Now, incels are short for involuntary celibates. Now, involuntary celibate is exactly what it sounds like. People are not getting what they want from women, and they basically created sort of a subculture and a movement which has turned violent. We've had women killed in Toronto, Los Angeles, Tallahassee, Florida, who are adherents of this movement. So again, that's not left or right. That's just pure hatred of women, and that's extremism. To your second point, because I think it's really important to wrap things up with some hope, right? I mean, you guys just spent an hour, and I don't want to leave everybody completely depressed, but there are things that we can do, right? I don't expect people in their day-to-day lives to do what we do in the center and at ADL, which is share information with law enforcement about extremist threats and hopefully prevent people from carrying out attacks, and in fact, actually succeed in doing so. I don't expect people to, completely understand these extremist movements and then, go to their elected officials and provide them information so they can change laws. I understand people have a certain amount of time on their hands, but I think there are little things that we can do. And one is, I think, supporting the concept of critical thinking at a young age and supporting educational programs, for example, the ones at ADL, but others as well. Because my understanding of these educational programs, and I'm the guy who looks at extremism, but I know this has value, is that you're not just teaching kids to understand what hate and extremism sort of is, how to identify it, but you're teaching them not to be innocent bystanders, right? That they have a role to play in calling out and being allies. And that's, by the way, something we can all use. When you see a neighbor, a friend, person in your community who's targeted for hate and violence, you need to stand up and be an ally. I think teaching kids at a young age how to do that, but also how to have critical thinking skills, considering how many people are trying to prey upon them online, I think is critical. I think speaking out is still very important. I think our voices matter. Steve mentioned reaching out to an elected official, but you don't have to have the biggest policy recommendation. What you can do when you reach out to your elected officials, say, these are my values. This is what I believe in. And I want you to represent me based on those values. You don't have to have every policy understanding. I also think another way that is a little underrated, if you see something, say something. That's what my subway tells me every day. But if you see hatred, report it, because data is so important. How do we know where to resource to the threat? How do we know what kind of policing to put in a community if it's under attack? We need to know if there are hate incidents happening so that we can make sure elected officials take it seriously. So report an incident that you see. It's the one thing you can absolutely do, and you can be anonymous. And the last thing I will say is do not lose hope. I know these are heavy topics, right? I know that they can be depressing. I know sometimes we can watch what we're watching. It's like the world's coming to an end, but it's not. It's not. Because every time there's an incident that occurs like this, there's an opportunity for good people to reject it, stand up for something good. And actually, those are the stories that I remember. And Steve, I'm going to conclude with 20 more seconds here. I do remember January 6th for what happened in DC. I also remember January 6th, I make sure to remember, as the day the first African-American senators in the state of Georgia were ever elected. To me, that's also a sign of progress. So you can find hope and progress. That's kind of what America is. We take the good and we take the bad, but we fight against the bad.
Thanks so much, Oren. That's really appreciate all these insights. I'm going to turn it over to Scott. Are you going to wrap up for us?
Great, thank you. Oren and Steve and Leah and any ADL colleagues that I'm leaving out, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know you're overwhelmed with work and responsibility right now, so the fact that you still met with us. It was about 3 months ago, one of our synagogue's members, Nancy Rader, came to Lori and myself and gave us a push to put something like this together. So thank you to Nancy for doing that. And at that time, we put the 14th on the calendar. We never would have imagined just how important of a date that was for us to get together as a community and discuss. And to everyone who joined tonight, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope not enjoyed, but found it informative in ways in which you can take action and learn. And Steve just put something into the chat box, a link that I would encourage you all to grab before we end here. I would also direct you to adl.org. You can learn more, find some helpful information, and learn ways in which you can take some action. Thank you, and everyone have a terrific evening.
Thanks for your partnership. Thank you very much.